Okay. Hello, everybody. Very happy to be here for this fireside chat. I don't know where's the fire, but we're going to have a chat with Professor Stiglitz. So let me take just 5 minutes to remind some of you who is Joe Stiglitz, despite him needing, of course, no introductions. Looking back at your biography, there's a few things I did know, of course, that you're one of the top cited economists so as for the profession because of all his work on imperfect competition and asymmetric information, which is what got Joe Stiglitz the Nobel Prize in 2001, together with Akerlof and Spence. So that's on the academic side, but the broadness of Joe Stiglitz's work is amazing. And then he also took a lot of responsibilities. One being the Council of Economic Advisor member and then chairman during the Bill Clinton presidency, and that probably is going to give Professor Stiglitz a lot of perspective on nowadays administration, because he was actually quite involved in a quite different administration. He was also the chief economist of the World Bank, and that's going to bring us to the topics we're going to talk today about: international economics and international relations in general. Being chief of the World Bank, chief economist of the World Bank and vice president of the World Bank, therefore, is actually giving you a complete overview of where things are going. And there's an incredible number of reports, among which I'm gonna cite two. There was one which is actually associated with Sciences Po. So there's this Stiglitz Fitoussi report ordered by Nicolas Sarkozy at the time, looking at the way we compute economic performance, the way we actually represent economic performance and well-being, and how we can reform that. That was a very important piece of work that actually was intended not only for academia, but also for the general public. There was also United Nations Commission for Development and for the reform of the financial monetary system. One thing I didn't know, that very recently you got nominated by the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, which I didn't know, so by the Pope himself, in charge of putting up a report on debt, and in particular on sovereign debt, which is going to talk a lot about inter-country inequality, so that once you're nominated by the Pope to something, that, you know, on top of every other honor that Joe Stiglitz had, that tells a lot. So after this short introduction, I think we're going to have first a discussion with Joe about different aspects of multilateralism and how the Trump administration getting into power, Trump 2 administration, changes things, but maybe not only about the Trump administration. This chat is going to be a chat. Therefore, after our sort of discussion, we will welcome you to ask questions, of course. There are 2 microphones out there. So we will keep the question up at the end of this thing. Let's say we keep about 22 minutes of discussion and questions by yourself. So feel free to prepare your questions while the discussion, and then line up out there, and we'll take them and answer. So I had let me start by a question on multilateralism in the U.S. administration. So the move away by the U.S. From multilateralism is very spectacular under the current administration. But my feeling is that there's a lot of people speaking in the U.S. saying, well, this is, and in the multilateral institutions such as WTO, United Nations, NATO, that actually say it's not only Trump 2, and it's actually not only Trump 1. It's more general dissatisfaction of the United States in general with the multilateral system. So maybe a little bit provocative here, or maybe I thought, thinking about this, why, in your experience, are the U.S. becoming more dissatisfied with the multilateral system? Are there good reasons for being dissatisfied, or is it really some drift away from the common thing?
So, I mean, maybe we should go back to at the end of World War II. The U.S. was very central in the creation of the multilateral system. The UN at San Francisco, the World Bank and the IMF at Bretton Woods, those were all in 1944. And trying to create a broad rules-based system. But even at that moment, when it came to certain aspects of economics, there was, U.S. has a long history of isolationism, and it came in conflict with the sentiment on the other side, say by President Roosevelt and Truman on the Democrat side, of the need to cooperate. So the U.S. rejected the multilateral trade agreement.
Yes.
And it was not until 1995 that the WTO was created. So that's 50 years after there had been an original proposal that U.S. helped craft, but Congress said no. So there's always been a worry, a concern about, and an isolationist trend in the United States.
Which is an interesting reversal, is that the president was in favor of multilateral agreements, but at the time the Congress said
it was the Republicans in Congress. So there was a continuation of the Republican sentiment of an isolationist wing of the Republican Party. I think a view among many both sides in the subsequent decades was that the international institutions were a good way of amplifying U.S. power. And so if we could control the IMF, great idea, we get the whole world to do what we want. And I think the unhappiness began when the rest of the world didn't do exactly what we wanted. So when the WTO appellate body, for instance, was created, there was a lot of worry about it, because here you were subjecting U.S. We have a dispute between us and some other country. The preceding mechanism is we would bash somebody and they would give in. And here we were saying we were actually committed to a rules-based system. And a lot of, especially Republicans, did not like that idea that we would be subjected to international law. And so there was a lot of unhappiness. And it then turned out, it worked okay for a few decades after that. But then eventually there were some cases against the United States where we lost. And that was the big mistake. As long as the WTO appellate body always supported us, we were in favor of it. But when the court ruled against us, we said it was overreach. They had not, they were, even though the judges in some of these cases were American appointed judges. One has to understand it was the special interest, the producer interests that get very unhappy and beat up on the U.S. government. So it was reflecting the politics of the moment. I think the other big change in multilateral, and so when Trump says the international trade agreements are unfair to the U.S., what he means that is sometimes we lose cases. And I always thought it was very peculiar because we wrote the rules. You have to understand, there's people come together to write the rules, but it's basically the EU and the United States that write the rules, and so there's a disconnect between what I've been a big critic of some of the provisions, but that was because they were unfair to developing countries, not unfair to the United States. And I don't think anybody objectively looking at it would say that they're unfair to the United States. But what that means is we're not getting our way all the time. And so that's really, and I think the broader sense of unhappiness, maybe this is that there's a nostalgia for the world after World War II, when we had something like 40% of world GDP. We could dominate global politics. And the fact is now, China is a country which in PPP terms is larger than the United States. We didn't like that. We tried to get the World Bank to say that that was not true. And the World Bank said, it is true. And China actually didn't want the U.S. want the World Bank to say it was largest, because they knew that the U.S. would be very unhappy if they said that China was larger than the United States, and they didn't care about being number one. U.S. cared about being number one. So that was so the change in the role of the U.S. globally has obviously caused unhappiness, and what you're seeing is now Trump trying to reassert U.S. power.
It's interesting what you say about the U.S. not liking to be said or not being anymore the number one country or the number one, because it looks like it's very psychological, right? It's about sentiments. And it's interesting that multilateralism is all about the rule of law and international abiding by the rules. And so there's this sort of shift towards sentiments dominating international relations, at least for the U.S., but not only for the U.S. So that's an interesting shift. It has probably to do with the way politics now are dominated by instant feelings and instant polls. But another thing that is, another thing is that the U.S., you said, was essentially happy when it was setting the rule, being number one, but also being number one exporter in the world, right? So it's now unhappy about the surpluses of China, but it's not because it's unhappy about imbalances. It's unhappy, what you're saying is, when it used to be a big surplus country, it was very happy about it.
Yeah. Let me put it in China, there's a lot of discussion about this rebalancing, and a book that's become very popular is Graham Allison, who's at the Kennedy School, who has characterized this as the Thucydides trap, a reference to when Persia and Athens were in conflict, and Persia did not like being number two, and that they went to war. And so the view in China is very much that the reason for U.S. peculiar behavior is that it is having difficulty accepting not being number one. So he wrote a whole book with that perspective. But to understand Trump, there's more to it than that, because I think most Americans really don't care about the surplus or deficit. Those are just numbers. But Trump thinks that because the United States is the best country in the world, people should be buying more of our goods than we are buying of their goods. So he sees a trade that if people aren't buying our goods, somebody must be playing unfair. And so the deficit is not only a matter of economics in his mind, it's a symptom of unfairness. And I don't know if the picture of the tariffs that he imposed, and everybody figured, where did he get those tariff numbers from? Even tariffs on an island where there are only penguins. And they came from looking at the trade deficit and then saying that's a measure of how unfair they are, and interpreting that as a percentage term as reciprocal tariffs. But there's one more thing that illustrates or two other things that illustrate the primitiveness of Trump. The first is that he only looks at trade in goods, the deficit in goods. And we've become a service sector economy, and we have surpluses in financial services, education services, health services. We're actually net in a lot of services. He's doing everything he can to destroy all those by, for instance, making sure that nobody wants to visit the United States, because if you visit, you may get an extra trip to Louisiana in detention for a few weeks without your phone. So it doesn't make it a very place where tourists want to go or people want to go to school. So he's really destroying, undermining our service sector. But the second thing that he doesn't understand, and I hope all of you do understand this, is that the magnitude of the total deficit in goods and services is a macroeconomic phenomena. It's not, if a country has aggregate savings that are less than aggregate investment, that gap is going to be reflected in an inflow of capital, which is the corresponding to a deficit in goods and services. And because his policies have led to a reduction in domestic savings, essentially a deficit, a fiscal deficit is negative savings by the government. And his policies are leading to increased deficits, i.e. more negative savings. And so the gap between aggregate savings and aggregate investment is likely to increase. And the result of that is the deficit in goods and services in the aggregate is likely to increase. And that's what happened in the first Trump administration.
Yeah. So on this misconception of global deficits as being the result of unfair practices, so that's sort of this mercantilist view of the world. It must be by revealed flows that everybody's unfair to the great American products, as you said. It seemed to be...
He's particularly concerned, he grew up in the 1950s where everybody loved cars. Yeah. So he's particularly concerned about German cars, and that we're buying more German cars than they're buying American cars. And he doesn't understand why people don't want to buy American cars in Europe.
That's maybe because when he comes to Europe, he comes with this massive SUV, and so he doesn't realize that he doesn't actually go through the streets of Paris. Maybe we should put him in a normal car next time, and that could sort of educate him to the constraints in Europe. One thing that really surprised me is that, in a sense, this sort of basic macroeconomic error in the thinking, the rest, at least of the industrialized world, the rest of the G7 and more broadly, sort of understands that very well. And what surprised me is that each and every country, and the EU included, seems to be now playing the game of saying to Trump, okay, you are right, actually. We have a surplus with respect to the United States in terms of goods, and that needs to be corrected, and we're going to do deals with that. So what my take as a trade economist is that it's hard to figure out whether, a world in which that makes sense, but I'd like to have your idea about that.
Yeah, I think there are two reasons underlying what I call the capitulation of Europe and other countries. In the case of Europe, the reason is that you do not have an independent defense, and that there's a war in Ukraine going on. This is not about trade. This is about the war in Ukraine, and that you are dependent on the United States for military goods. Trump is vindictive, and the worry was, that if you didn't make the trade agreement, you would not be able to get the defense goods that you needed. So you have to see the trade agreement not in light of normal trade relation. Because if you thought of this as a normal trade relationship and you forgot, wiped out the rule of law, which Europe has a little bit of a proclivity to try to follow, even when the other side is not, and you just set this up as a bargaining problem, Europe is, and the rest of the world is far larger. The U.S. has only, is less than 20% of global GDP and probably less than about 30% of global trade. It's not important. And why people are caving in to a country that's not important, one has to, ask why. That was the question you were asking. And in the case of Europe, it's not, I think, about what would be a reasonable bargaining in a trade deal, but the result of defense. And I think the European response needs to be urgently creating defense autonomy, because what you have done is surrendered your national sovereignty, nationally and EU-wide. And I can't emphasize the extent to which you are in the process of giving up on your sovereignty. Whenever any country signs an agreement with Trump, it's not worth the paper that it's written on. And this was not even written down, so it's even less. But within 10 days or so of the agreement, the U.S. was saying that Europe had to get rid of its Digital Marketing Act, Digital Service Act, France had to get rid of its digital taxes. It was much more expansive it's not just trade, it's trying to defend the industries of American oligarchs, our high-tech industry, and against regulations that I think are if anything, too lenient, not strong enough. Yeah. And so you should be going the other way, not getting rid of them. The other reason that I think probably mistakenly countries are giving in is they think that Trump is a passing phenomena, and that the best way of dealing with this irritation is to give in for a while and get it over with. So why go to war when in 3 years' time there's going to be a normal government in the United States? My response is I wouldn't count on it. And, you know, I'm not sure we're going to have a democratic election, a fully democratic election in 2026, 2028. And to go back to your first remark, the disillusionment with multilateralism is bipartisan. So even if a democratic government came in, on many of these issues, you will be fighting. I mean, the refusal of the U.S. to appoint appellate judges at the WTO began, you know, all through the Biden administration, and began even before the Trump administration, the first Trump administration.
Yeah, even with the first Trump, yeah. So yes, there is this hegemon, the U.S. that used to be a full hegemon and is now a lower hegemon and tries to bully its military power against trade agreements. Whether this military power in helping defend Ukraine is a credible commitment remains to be seen.
Yeah.
But that's the way those things are working. So it means that multilateralism essentially was endangered by the fact that there used to be a benevolent hegemon which saw the multilateral system as something positive for him. Yes,
Yeah.
for the hegemon, into a sort of hegemon that doesn't find that it's a good idea anymore. It raises the question, okay, does the multilateralism first need a hegemon, and it can survive without a benevolent hegemon that views it in its favor? That is, whatever new hegemonic power comes in place, if there is one, can it actually come back, multilateralism, or does it need now like more equilibrated, balanced power for this thing to come back, or is it something we have to forget?
So first, I think the core idea of multilateralism is that there are benefits from cooperation. And I think the answer to that is pretty obvious. Climate change, pandemics, actually, much of, you know, there's a whole infrastructure that one doesn't normally think about, like post offices, you know, communications. There are lots of rules and lots of institutions that we don't think about because they're just doing their job. And they're not controversial, but they're part of multilateralism in a broad sense. So unique standards. So the point is that there are large benefits to cooperation. Then the question is, multilateralism has been used in two ways. Some of it has been used to advance cooperation in mutually beneficial ways, which mean like controlling externalities, addressing global public goods. But some of multilateralism has been a reflection of power and trying to get other countries to do what the US or the EU want to do. So multilateralism is part of the process of, you know, I don't want to use this evocative language, but of maintaining neocolonialism. If you look at the structure of the tariffs, they were really designed, in the WTO, they were designed to make sure that developing countries kept producing primary goods and the value-added stayed in the advanced countries. So, you know, and you could look at the way the global financial system worked was very much making sure that the benefits of flow to the advanced countries, and particularly the United States, even though it led to a more unstable global system. So those are instances where the international rules were not in the interest of most of the world, but were in the interest of the hegemon, and not only U.S., but also Europe. So in reconstructing multilateralism after Trump, I think it ought to and will have to focus on the global externalities, the real benefits of cooperation. And that will, and there are disagreements about the magnitude. We don't have a global government. We have a system of global governance without a global government. And that's going to mean that there will be, the agreements basically have to be self-enforcing. They have to be of the nature that people will want to cooperate. And that may mean that there will be sanctions for those who don't. Sanctions would be, you're excluded from our club, if you want to think of it that way. So they have to be designed to be much more self-enforcing, because what we know is that the current institutions have asymmetric enforcement. They're enforced against poor countries, like during the pandemic. We told poor countries, you cannot use intellectual property that would enable you to fight AIDS. I mean, not AIDS, the COVID-19 that you could, and we also did that. But we didn't have a vaccine waiver of the kind that South Africa and India wanted. So we enforced the rules against the poor countries. But now it's very clear we are not enforcing the rules against the United States. So that's made it so transparent that there are not only asymmetries in the writing of the rules, there are asymmetries in the enforcement of the rules. And I think going forward, the recognition of that means that we will have to design rules that are self-enforcing. That it's nice to have a court, but if you can't enforce things, then, so that's going to, and where that itself is going to lead is to what's sometimes called a plurilateral system rather than multilateral. So various agreements that are agreements among coalitions of the willing. And so, I describe the broad architecture right now as G-1 or multilateralism minus the United States. There's no reason simply because U.S. decides not to be rule-based that the rest of the world can't go ahead on a rules-based system, and it is largely doing that. So I think those are the two ingredients. It'll be clubs, groups of countries that agree, and structured to be self-enforcing.
So you call for the constitutions of clubs, in a sense. So clubs on specific topics that would be with global externalities or global public good, and those clubs still, at some point, the U.S. being a big part of global production, let's talk climate, we would have to hope that those clubs generate a sort of a domino effect. So for instance, if you talk about the European unification process, this club of 6 countries grew and had more members, and at some point there were 2 clubs. Of course, nobody remembers it, but here at some point there was a club of the European community, and there was another club with the UK, with Portugal, with Spain. There was another club of free trade. But as members of the second club moved into the first club, which was the European community, it became more attractive to be part of that first club. And so we sort of hope that if we do a club of fighting, climate change, the US at some point will find it a good idea to join back. Yeah. But I'm not sure of that. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's right. And in fact, one aspect of the structure of the global clubs, a little different from the EU, would be that they would be much more open architecture. That is to say, anybody that wanted to join would be able to join, and they wouldn't be exclusive in the way that you would have to vote to be a member. And I think, you know, some of the incentives to join would be that there are privileges of being a member of that particular club. And what are the privileges? Like, I think some form of a cross-border adjustment CBAN would be part of the system. If you don't, if you don't tax carbon in your country in one way or another, regulate it, we will tax it and get the revenue. And well, that's an obvious incentive for you to tax, and that effectively, if you're already doing that taxes, then you might as well join the club and help set the rules. So that would be an example where the countries would agree that that's what they would do. Now, if you did that in the current environment with Trump, you have to, you know, understand that there will be retaliatory tariffs, and you just have to say, well, that's, you know, price you're going to have to pay, and that means that you realign your supply chains and where you're selling your goods, and from that perspective, the short-run costs are higher than the long-run cost. The short-run costs are that particular firms are selling particular goods in the United States, and they're making money out of it. Over the long run, the difference between selling those goods in the United States and selling those goods to, say, other parts of the world, where the other parts of the world who are in the club also agree that they will impose a cross-border adjustment, Europe gets very little in the aggregate net benefit. I mean, those benefits are exaggerated. So you get lobbied by the people who in the short run are going to feel the pain. So you have to recognize that. But in the long run, the extra surplus you get from selling to the United States is really very, very small.
So going back to those clubs and how to enforce those clubs, as you said, once you got a club, you got rules, and you got to enforce deviations because there might be prisoner's dilemma, and you might have an interest to pretend you're in the club and do short-run gains, as you were saying. One thing that I heard and read was that in order to enforce, sometimes, let's take climate change. Okay, there are emissions, and emissions, they actually need to be monitored, and you can't really rely on the self-declaration of countries because they might have an incentive to lie. And so a lot of those emissions right now, I understand, are sort of monitored by satellites and all sorts of technology. There's an infrastructure that looks at. And my fear is that in order to enforce those benevolent clubs, you rely on infrastructure and technology that might actually be organized and monitored by the US, by somebody that wants to be out of the club, and sometimes want to destroy that whole infrastructure in order not to be able to monitor emissions. So that's one of the cases where maybe there might be a problem. You have to develop your own infrastructure.
Well, what I would say, Europe's dependence on the United States right now is because of defense and technology. And most of your data is in the cloud, which is controlled by Microsoft and Amazon. And I don't know about you, but I don't feel safe having them controlling all the data that I have. And the irony is, the U.S. recognized that where your data is really important. And they insisted anybody dealing with China had to have their data in a Western cloud. But Europe never thought about their reliance not on satellites and on the cloud and a lot other aspects of the technology. Many people in Europe say, that you're way behind. I don't think that's actually true, in the following sense, that it wouldn't take much to catch up. You are behind right now, but the question is the ability to use the existing knowledge that's in the world. Are they really secret? How much? It may be best practice is a little bit above what is common knowledge, but any graduate of one of your better engineering schools can set up a cloud and could set up a tech company that is just as good as, or almost as good as Google. It might not steal your data quite as much because you have all these privacy laws, but given the constraint, it would do almost as good a job of stealing your data. So I think your companies have the ability to be just as bad as American companies, and it wouldn't take them very long to learn how to do it. And so if Google disappeared, it would be a great opportunity. If Amazon disappeared. So, the transition would be painful, and you shouldn't wait for that moment. You should start developing your own technology. And one of the things, how does industrial policy move you on, besides supporting research? Well, one of the things is, for instance, to have a common platform in which everybody in Europe has to pay their taxes. And so everybody in Europe would have an account. And once you have an account, then you've solved the problem of the network externalities. Everybody's there. And, I find it astounding that European leaders are using Musk's X to make announcements. You have this guy who supports the far, far right in the UK. I mean, he's supporting the right that is the right of the Reform Party, which is right of the Conservative Party. So this is far, far right, and interfering in elections and turning off Ukraine's access to information if he doesn't like what they're doing. And your leaders are using that platform and giving him money effectively. So, you have the ability to create your own technology town hall, and you can use your tax system to force people to join it.
That's good news. Our companies can be as bad as American companies. Our politicians can be as bad as American politicians. But the good news is that our universities can be as good as American universities. And actually, Trump is helping us this way.
Oh, Trump is really helping you.
Because of the H-1B visas and hitting the universities. So he might actually help us on that.
A lot.
And quite a lot. With Columbia, UCLA, Harvard, big hits, there might be the...
Well, in our whole science budget, America's comparative advantage has been based on science, technology, and then he says, I don't like science and technology. He said it during his first administration, but the Republican Congress recognized that that was reckless. And they stopped him. It was so clear that if he got reelected, he would be unconstrained. He dominated the Congress. So I organized a letter of a large number of science Nobel Prize winners who said Trump represented a real threat to science. And, we in the campaign, we circulated that letter, and they say a large number of American scientists signed it, and we were right. And we forecast that it was going to be very bad for science, and it really is in every way.
You should have, like Trump, a cap say, I was right on everything. I was right on everything. Okay, so let me open the floor to questions. So you got the mics here so that we can have 15 to 10 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes of questions. So if you can keep, yes, so if you can keep the questions a little bit short, please, so that we can have as many interactions as we can.
1, 2, is it working?
Yeah, it's working.
So, Monsieur Stiglitz, merci beaucoup pour votre présence. Thanks a lot for being here and for this Platonic banquet to be able to hear your thoughts for the current affairs. When you mentioned climate change, I thought of two great American activists, namely Robert Redford and Jane Goodall, that passed away recently. Jane Goodall, especially, I think it's a source of hope, and her writings bring so much optimism towards the future. I don't even want to invoke the name of the current administration. I think it's such a heavy load in terms of what they are doing to science and to knowledge. So I was wondering about what are your current readings regarding the future, regarding the next elections and a possible administration? What are the books that you'd recommend a young student to read in terms to find hope in the current quite scary political circumstances? Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you. Joe, give us
Well,
some...
I don't have any readings that I find credible that would give hope. The book, my most recent book, The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society, I wrote in the hope that...
Buy this book.
and it's also in French.
It's also in French. Make the advertisement.
In the hope that it might have some effect on the election, and that discussions of, there was an alternative to where we were going. I thought neoliberal capitalism was setting us up for the kind of problems that we have now faced. I think the disillusionment in our body politic was predictable. I mean, it was predicted. And that there were alternatives. And the existence of alternatives is a source of hope. But, and you might say right now, I can't give you readings, but the real source of hope is that things will be bad enough that the Democrats retake Congress in 2026 and the presidency in 2028. And the hope is that we won't have troops in the streets in 2026 during the election. And the real question is, what is the probability that we will have free and fair elections? And no one really knows.
I'm going to alternate. So on the right. A series of questions. Yeah, let's take a series of 3-4 questions, and then but keep them short, please.
Okay, Professor Mayer, Professor Stiglitz, thanks a lot. It's wonderful listening to you. My question is about international free trade agreements and their fairness. Well, my country, Georgia, has free trade agreements both with the European Union and also with China. And the European Union imposes very strict restrictions which restricts countries' policy space. China does not necessarily restrict countries' industrial policy tools, but Georgia still remains very dependent on critical raw material exports. And my question is difficult to answer, but I really want to know what realistic strategies do small developing economies can have to avoid being locked in this peripheral condition. Thank you.
Thank you. Can we do
Yeah, I didn't get the question exactly.
Okay. Can we get another one out there?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Stiglitz, for coming here today. My question builds upon the previous question. So my name is Luke, and I'm from Indonesia. I think globalization did not work well before, and even worse today. The same goes with rule-based international order and free trade. Given this worsening situation, what would your advice be to the developing countries that depended on that global public goods to advance themselves in the development ladder, if there is still any? Would you suggest more economic alignment to China as the alternative power, despite their similar hegemonic tendency? And how do you think should the developing countries suffer what they must the least? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for being with us here today. I hope my question isn't too redundant, but I think a common fear in Europe and in any country that, for example, wants to raise taxes on wealthy people or stronger tax or face up to these big American conglomerates or tech giants is that individuals or companies might become so irritated with that new legislation that they punish or even abandon a market. If you could just share your thoughts on that, if you think that that's true at all, and if so, or even if not, how something like that could be addressed.
Thank you. Let's take a last one, and we do a round of answers and then other
Okay,
questions.
so dear professor, I'm so happy you are here sharing with us your insights. And I have a question about the multilateralism, because as you mentioned, here in WTO we have many problems, and I heard that so many judges are right now considering quitting the organization, and even the actual position they are not full. In this case, do you still have confidence in the World Bank and in WTO, and why? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. So let's do a round of maybe, because the last question was about the World Bank, and you're an expert on the World Bank, of course. Maybe you can give us hope with the World Bank, or maybe not.
Well, let me first say that I think there is an important role for development banks in general. I think development banks play an important role, or can play. The markets tend to be short-sighted and not willing to finance long-term development projects. Many of the projects that development banks get engaged in, like climate or health or education, hard to, we said bank them. They're hard to get returns directly, and the interest rates that the market imposes are actuarially unfair for developing countries. They charge an interest rate which, correcting for risk, is still too high. That the market, there's a market failure. That's very clear, and the development banks help correct that. So I really think that they have a very big potential in a number of dimensions. In the past, because they've been controlled by the advanced countries, they've sometimes been used when they've worked together with the IMF to stifle development. So, for instance, they went to Africa and they insisted in the period of the 80s in Africa opening its markets, and the result of that was Africa went through what we call premature deindustrialization. So rather than promoting development like occurred in East Asia, where there was a lot of industrialization, in that same period, Africa was going through deindustrialization, and standards of living were going down. And the World Bank, working with the IMF, was part of the cause of that, which led to a quarter century of stagnation. So, I want to make it clear that they haven't always been successful, but there are a lot of now green development banks, new development banks, and there's greater sensitivity. I wouldn't count on it if Trump gets to appoint the next head of the World Bank. Officially, Europe it's appointed by the board, and the U.S. does not have the power. But Europe has always given in to the U.S. And so it's really up to Europe whether the World Bank fails. So right now, you know, it's actually contributing a lot to climate in spite of Trump's hostility to climate.
Maybe I can provide some answers also because it relates to the questions about small developing economies and how, you know, do they live in this new world of broken multilateralism. I think one of the key things you're saying, the World Bank and the IMF in the 80s forced them to open, especially African countries. But in the recent years, there's been a number of free trade agreements between the US and small poor economies, and the EU also, and they benefited quite a lot. I think what was worse in that big black, you know, this big board with the tariffs was that Vietnam and a lot of other and a lot of African countries actually are going to be hit now with tariffs that are incredibly high, despite those economies having sort of started a process of industrialization and pretty much invested in the relationship with the U.S. So that's really a terrible thing that's going to happen.
And that's why the damage of Trump is long term. I mean, countries have now realized that borders do matter, that you cannot rely on the United States. They should realize they need to diversify their supply chain, both up and down, customers and sources of product, that relying on the U.S. in the way, say, that Vietnam is just too risky.
Yeah.
I should add the free trade agreements are not free trade agreements. You know, one of the things that you should be learning, and we teach our students, that you pick a name that's the opposite of what is in an agreement or a law. So if you call it, a law for freedom, it's really about restricting behavior or something like that. So we hope you learn how to sell your bad things. So in this particular case, I'll tell a very brief story. A small Latin American country, the president came to me and said, should he sign this free trade agreement with the U.S.? And I knew that he was a doctor, and a medical doctor, a real doctor, not. And doctors in Latin America, as in everywhere, have to sign what's called the Hippocratic Oath, which says, do no harm. So I said, I know you're a doctor. I assume you signed the Hippocratic Oath, right? And he said, yes. I said, you can't sign it then. Because the agreement would harm the country. And that's because these agreements are not symmetric. They're managed trade agreements. Some of them wind up benefiting particular countries when they're managed well. China did fantastically out of some of the joining the WTO. In the case of Mexico, I think it benefited, but one of the provisions of the agreement with Mexico, the so-called free trade agreement with Mexico, was that they had to open up their border to American corn. American corn, the corn farmers, 50% of their income comes from Washington. It doesn't come from, so they were competing not with the corn farmers, but with government subsidies. It was totally unfair. And it really hurt the poorest people in Mexico, which were the corn farmers. So, that's the sense in which the complex consequences of some of the so-called free trade agreements are very, very adverse. The same thing goes for the partnership agreements. They're not real partnerships.
Of course not.
The terms are dictated.
Especially if they have comprehensive partnership.
Yeah, the more comprehensive, the less partnership. But one thing I wanted to comment, as you look at this global architecture, one of the things I mentioned before has been that it's not clear that the provisions of a lot of the trade agreements are conducive to promoting economic growth. And one of the examples of that are some of the, is in Indonesia. Indonesia, is lucky to have some rich resources like a nickel, and it said, we want the nickel to be processed, made into goods in Indonesia. And that policy has been one of the very successful policies of the Indonesian government. But Europe is bringing Indonesia to the WTO and saying that's an unfair trade practice. And that's an example of a lack of sensitivity, I think, on the part of Europe and the rules, that they are not sensitive to some of the need for subsidies for developing countries to have industrial policies to grow, to catch up. And the irony is, of course, the U.S. is using industrial policies under a Democratic administration. The green subsidies were, estimated between $1 and $1.5 trillion. European leaders were complaining that they couldn't compete with the U.S. With the magnitude of the subsidies. So you can imagine what developing countries feel about that.
Let's take a few other questions, and because we're already past time, sorry, Cecilia. There's no lecture after that, right? So a few really quick questions, please, and then a round of things.
Thank you, Mr. Stiglitz, for being today here with us. You mentioned earlier that the problem of Europe is its dependence on defense regarding the United States and technology. One of the problematics of the defense industry, the defense development in the European Union, is one, agreement among member states, and the second one is the fact that countries buy actual defense from the European industry because of the dependence it has from the United States. How should the European Union and European countries go about doing that, like buying without a backlash from the United States? Thank you.
My question is somewhat similar. I wanted to ask you about the war in Ukraine and its economic implications on the European Union and on Ukraine itself. So I was also inquiring about whether you think the future of Europe economically looks bright to you, or the future of Ukraine as well, and how those two interrelate. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question.
Hi, professors. Thank you both. Professor Stiglitz, thank you for gracing us with your presence. I think you've hinted that you would encourage it, but I'm wondering if you would foresee that the US retreat from the international stage and the kind of decline in Western multilateralism that has followed, if you think that opens up a large enough space for traditionally marginalized countries of the global South to play a more active role in shaping the international order.
Thank you. Let's take a last question.
What are your thoughts on the proposed Zuckman tax on ultra-rich and oligarchs, either in the US or in Europe or wherever you believe it could be implemented? And do you think that this would lead to a de facto capital outflow, or do you believe this is an exaggeration? Thank you.
Hear that? Can you hear that?
Yeah. Okay. So a lot of good questions. Let me first, a whole cluster of questions about Ukraine, defense. My long-term inclination has been anti-spending money on defense. Partly, we had these wars in Vietnam, then Iraq and Afghanistan that made very little sense. and we were spending enormous amounts of money on weapons that didn't work against enemies that didn't exist. So I was very critical. But it's clear now that enemies do exist. And I do think it is extraordinarily important for Europe to defend against Russian aggression. Rule of law, I mean, and it will go against other countries at the border. So to me, it's an existential issue about rule of law, democracy, human rights. I think there are problems in the way Europe's defense industry is organized, the fact that it's fractured. Airbus is an example where Europe came together and cooperated and succeeded in making, really the best airplanes in the world now, and clearly did a far better job than Boeing. And I feel more comfortable flying on Airbus than on one of our planes that is likely to crash. So I think that that's a model that shows that one can be successful. I was a little bit shocked about when the NATO meeting and the leaders got together and Trump said you needed to spend 5% on GDP, that only one of Europeans' leaders stood up to Trump and said, we're not going to be dictated by you, as Sanchez of Spain. And no one pointed out the U.S. only spends 3 to 3.5%. And the U.S. would never be able to get through a 5% budget through our Congress. The devastating effects that would have on Medicare, Medicaid, it won't happen. So it isn't the amount you spend, it's how you spend it and the efficiency. And I think Europe, Ukraine is developed very quickly a drone industry that is, probably number one, or with Russia, number 1 or 2 in the world. And that's happened in the middle of a war. If they can do that, why can't Europe have a 21st century defense industry? Now, whatever, that would require not being dependent on the U.S. Anything that Europe does under the current context that Trump doesn't like risks backlash. That's just the reality. What is the form of the backlash? Trump has one instrument and one tool that he loves, and you all know what it is. I'll increase your tariff. But he'll find one reason or another to increase your tariff if he wants to. So, in the case of Brazil, Brazil had a surplus, a deficit with the U.S. So there it was because he thinks that if you try to overthrow the government or not respect the election, you shouldn't be tried. Yes. So that the use of tariffs as a political instrument has never been done before. So and in most of these cases, like if you stand up to him, as we say, taco, Trump always chickens out. So I think you either, you take the risk, and if he doesn't, you have to say national sovereignty, European sovereignty is more important than the little bit of economic advantage that you get from trading with the U.S. The question about whether the new architecture will have more role, it will be different for developing countries. It will be a different architecture. I do think that there will be more role for developing countries. But it also is a very big opening to China. And the interesting thing is, you know, China is not really a socialist economy. It's a peculiar state capitalism, authoritarian, very successful, moving 800 million people out of poverty. But it's, you know, you can't think of it in, you know, but it is a separate institutional arrangement, and it is competing for the hearts and minds of those in Africa and Latin America, and very successfully so. So I think it is a big opening. China will play a bigger role, and China, even though it doesn't have what we would view rule of law within their country, has been an advocate for rule of law internationally. And it's really interesting, I find, in the current context, China is far more reliable as a partner than the U.S.
And sometimes than the EU.
What?
And they defend the WTO more than the EU, actually, in the recent years.
And because they're coming up, and they recognize how much they have benefited from rule-based system, and so they are quite strong supporters. The final question about the minimum wealth tax. I'm a great advocate of the minimum wealth tax. You might say, I think it's a very conservative proposal. And I think what I find very interesting is the nature of the opposition. Because, you know, think about it. Very rich people have gotten rich partly because they've gotten high returns to capital. If they're getting, the kind of returns that people with high returns are getting, they're getting at least 10% return on their capital. It should be higher than that if you're a good exploiter. So you're getting a 10% return on capital, and a 2% tax says that is equivalent on wealth, is equivalent to 20% of the income that you're generating from that. So when you stand up and say, I don't like a minimum tax of 2%, you're saying I'm paying less than 20% tax rate. Mm-hmm. Or you're saying, I don't know how to manage my wealth and I'm not getting a return. So the guys who, one of your very wealthy guys has been very critical of Zucman, and what he's saying is either that I don't know how to make a return on my capital, or I'm paying half or a third of the rate that the rest of the French people are paying. I find it amazing that he's admitting that. And that should be brought out. It's really such a conservative proposal, and with France facing obvious need for a fiscal deficit and closing that fiscal deficit, and with the increase in wealth inequality in France in the last 20 years has been enormous. The natural thing is follow the money. Are you going to ask the poorest people to pay or the richest people to pay? And it seems to me such an obvious proposal. I don't understand why there's any controversy about it.
Very good. A very good way to end that meeting. Thank you. Sorry very much for the other questions, but we're already 15 minutes past the time. Thanks a lot for everybody. Thanks a lot to Professor Stiglitz for being here. I think it's an honor each time Joe comes to Sciences Po, so thanks a lot.